I grew up tagging along with my dad on his late-night patrols through the reserve. Most kids would have found it boring, even creepy, but I lived for those nights. There's something grounding about the forest at that hour, when everything else is asleep. My dad, Tom, wasn't much for talking during patrols, though. He kept his eyes on the path, head down, and his grip on that flashlight steady as a rock. The older I got, the more I noticed he followed a set of rules he eventually passed on to me. Never leave the path, he'd say, looking straight ahead, his voice flat, calm, but firm. And if you see any strange lights, don't look at them. Ignore them. Keep walking. I'd nod, swallowing down a million questions. Every time I thought to ask, he'd just shake his head, like he already knew what I'd say. And if you hear anyone calling you from the woods, Lucas, anyone, don't answer. That's not the kind of help we give here. He'd let that sit for a moment, just long enough to sink in before moving on. Years went by, and I followed every one of his rules without question. But last fall, something shifted in me. Call it curiosity or maybe just rebellion. I was 27, working a job in town, living on my own, but those nights patrolling the woods still had a grip on me. I wanted to know what was out there, to see the woods as he did, not just in flashes and shadows. That night, I decided to break a rule. It was late, and we were passing by a clearing I'd never seen in daylight. The moon hung low, casting everything in a pale glow. I slowed down, watching as my dad moved ahead, scanning the trees. Just as I lingered, something flickered out of the corner of my eye. A light. Small, faint, but unmistakably real, bobbing between the trees like a lantern someone had forgotten to turn off. Every part of me knew better, knew what he'd say. But I took a step toward it, then another, the crunch of leaves under my boots somehow softer than usual. The light drew me in, hovering just beyond reach. It wasn't like any flashlight or lantern I'd seen, more like a shimmer, almost alive. I couldn't shake the feeling that it was watching me, not the other way around. I stopped, looked over my shoulder, and realized I'd wandered farther than I'd meant to. My dad's flashlight was a distant beam now, swinging with his stride, unaware I'd broken formation. "Hello?" I called, my voice slipping out before I could stop myself. The instant I said it, the light darted back, deeper into the trees, teasing me, like it wanted me to follow, and I did, even as something in me screamed to turn back. The trees closed in, the air turning colder, almost metallic, filling my lungs with a sharpness that made each breath feel like a mistake. I'd never felt this kind of cold before. It wasn't right. That's when I realized the forest had gone quiet. No crickets, no distant rustle of animals, just the thud of my own heartbeat. I turned, tried to get my bearings, but the path had vanished. The trees, once familiar, seemed to shift, closing ranks. I felt a prickling on my skin, the unmistakable sense that I wasn't alone. I took a steadying breath, trying to focus, but everything felt wrong. The trees that had always been markers, familiar and predictable, now looked like strangers, twisted, leaning in as if to watch me. I'd never known the forest to turn on me like this. I called out, hoping my dad might hear me, might notice I'd slipped away. But my voice fell flat, swallowed up by the cold. Nothing answered back. A faint crackling sound broke the stillness, like leaves crunching underfoot, but slower, deliberate. My eyes darted around, scanning the shadows, but I saw no one. The hairs on my arms stood on end, an instinct telling me I wasn't alone. I took a step back, pulse racing, mind scrambling for an explanation. Maybe it was a deer or a stray hiker, but deep down, I knew that didn't add up. There was something else in here with me. That's when I smelled it. Iron, thick and metallic, coating the air like rusted metal left out in the rain. It reminded me of blood, fresh and potent. My stomach twisted and my feet felt cemented in place. Every nerve screamed at me to turn and run, but my body wouldn't respond. Then I heard a voice. Soft at first, almost a murmur, like it was coming from far off. But as it grew louder, it turned unmistakably familiar. "Lucas," it called, the voice clear now, calm, almost coaxing. It was my dad's voice. "Lucas, come here. You're safe." I felt a pang of relief at first, a fleeting comfort in the sound of my dad's voice. But something was off, a slight slur in the tone, an unnatural echo beneath the words. It sounded like him, sure, but hollow, like someone had copied the rhythm and missed the soul behind it. I felt my fingers twitch, ready to obey, but my gut told me to wait. I took a step back, scanning the darkness, hoping I'd see his familiar figure pushing through the trees. But what I saw was wrong. A shape took form, a foggy, shifting outline that seemed to breathe in out like smoke trapped in a glass jar. Slowly it condensed, solidifying into a figure, taller than my dad, the arms hanging low, the face blurred and melted like wax. And yet that smile, it wore a smile that was just close enough to his, twisted at the corners. I felt that smile reach me before the figure did. "Lucas," it said again, the voice deeper now, dragging out each syllable. I stumbled back, my back slamming into a tree, and I clenched my fists, trying to ground myself. Every instinct screamed, "Run." My dad had warned me, told me to ignore anything I heard calling from the trees. I understood why now. I tried to breathe, my mind spinning as I clung to the hope that he'd hear me, that he'd come for me. My breath came fast, each one sharper than the last. That thing was still there, shifting in and out like smoke fighting to stay solid. Its smile remained fixed, stretching into something that looked human, but not quite. I pressed myself harder against the tree, heart pounding, mind racing. The smell of iron filled my lungs, thick and cold, coating every breath. It called again, voice curling in the air between us. "Lucas, come closer." The sound had changed, deepening into something guttural, almost like a growl. The thing moved forward, slow, deliberate, as though savoring each step. Its eyes, if you could call them that, were empty, hollow, a darkness that seemed to pull everything around it inward. I knew I had to move, but my body wouldn't respond, locked up with a fear so raw I could hardly think. In the distance, I heard a voice, faint but real. My dad, calling out, sounding distant but unmistakable. "Lucas, where are you?" Relief washed over me, but that thing in front of me only seemed to notice, its head tilting to the side, listening. It knew my dad was coming. I couldn't shake the thought that it wanted him there too, like I was only the bait. The thing took a slow step back, blending into the shadows, still watching. Its face, half hidden, kept that impossible smile, patient. I forced my legs to move, one shaky step at a time, willing myself to stay quiet, to avoid drawing any more attention. I reached into my pocket, fingers brushing the cold metal of my pocket knife. It was small, almost laughably so, but the feel of it grounded me. I clung to the hope that if I could just get back to my dad, he'd know what to do. He'd always been so sure, so steady in these woods. Maybe he'd seen this before, or something like it. He'd kept secrets, that much I knew. Maybe this was one of them. The forest around me shifted, branches casting long, claw-like shadows that reached across the ground. I couldn't shake the feeling that the trees themselves were watching, bending in just close enough to let that thing slip through unnoticed. I kept walking, every sense on edge, the silence around me thick as fog. Every now and then, I'd catch a glimpse of movement from the corner of my eye, a flicker of that shape, darting between the trunks, waiting. Finally, my dad's flashlight broke through the dark, the beam bouncing as he moved closer, his face a mix of confusion and worry. "Lucas," he called, softer now, relief and warning laced in his voice. I felt a weight lift just seeing him, like I'd finally woken from a nightmare. But as I stepped toward him, a chill ran down my spine. I didn't look back, but I could feel it, the thing behind me, close, watching, hovering just out of sight. My dad grabbed my arm, his grip tight, and whispered, "Don't look back. Keep your eyes on me. Just walk." His words were so calm, so steady, but I could feel the urgency in them. We moved in silence, his flashlight guiding our steps, his gaze never wavering. I didn't dare ask him what he'd seen or why we had to keep moving, but a part of me knew. Whatever was out there, he knew about it, and he knew we couldn't face it. As we moved, his grip stayed firm, his hand a solid anchor pulling me through that endless maze of shadows. Every few steps, he'd give my arm a squeeze, a quiet signal to keep going. Don't look around, don't break stride. I could hear my own heartbeat, pounding out of sync with the rhythm of our steps. All around, I felt it. Eyes watching, breaths barely held back. My dad's face remained set, his jaw tight, his gaze pinned forward, like he was guiding us through something only he could see. The trees seemed alive, bending, shifting as if they'd grown overnight, their branches knitting together above us in tangled webs. I glanced up, and for a second, I thought I saw a face, pale and staring from the knots of a tree. My dad must have noticed my hesitation because he whispered, "Eyes on the path, Lucas. Nothing good's in those trees tonight." My stomach twisted. I'd never heard him sound like this, so close to breaking, so aware of something hidden. He'd been my rock, my guide in those woods since I was a kid, and seeing him afraid made it real, more real than I wanted it to be. The image of that thing I'd seen earlier, the hollow smile, the melted face, flashed in my mind, but I pushed it away, trying to focus on my dad's voice instead. After what felt like hours, he slowed down, our steps finally softening as we neared a clearing. But instead of relief, the air around us grew colder, sharper, the iron tang thickening again. "Almost there," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I could hear it, though, the doubt. I wanted to ask if he really knew where we were headed, if he could feel whatever was tracking us, but I didn't dare break the silence he'd so carefully built. Then, in the quiet, it came again, the call, smooth and low, mimicking his voice. "Lucas, come here, son." It was too close, closer than before, echoing from somewhere just behind. My dad's grip tightened, his fingers digging into my arm, his jaw clenched as he pushed us forward. The flashlight flickered, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch toward us, reaching like hands. My skin prickled as I felt something just inches away, following our every move. Suddenly, my dad stopped, his flashlight pointed straight ahead. The path had reappeared, winding out of the clearing like it had been waiting for us. I almost sagged with relief, but he held me back, his voice low and even. "Lucas," he murmured, "we don't run. Walk slow. Breathe." His calm settled over me, a lifeline against the chaos lurking in those trees. Together, we stepped forward, one careful foot in front of the other. Just as we crossed into the path, the presence grew stronger, almost palpable, pressing in around us. I glanced to my left, barely catching sight of a shadow, a glint of eyes, too many eyes, staring back. My stomach dropped, but I forced my head forward, remembering his warning. Whatever it was, it wouldn't follow us onto the trail, not as long as we kept moving, kept breathing steady. When we finally broke free, leaving the forest behind, the tension faded, but my dad didn't let go. His face was pale, his eyes dark, and for a long time, he just stared back at those trees, as though daring something to come out. We stayed there on the edge of the woods, my dad's hand still gripping my arm, his face locked on the trees. I could see in his eyes that he wasn't quite finished with whatever he thought he'd just left behind. He was tense, his jaw clenched, waiting, almost daring it to try following us. The forest loomed dark and still, like it was holding its breath. After what felt like forever, he exhaled and released my arm. "Come on," he said, barely above a whisper, nodding toward the truck. I followed him, still feeling the weight of eyes on my back, a chill crawling up my spine as we walked. Even with the forest behind us, its pull stayed thick, pressing down, as if it didn't want us to leave. Inside the truck, he didn't start the engine right away. He sat with his hands on the wheel, staring straight ahead. Finally, he spoke, his voice low. "I told you those rules for a reason, Lucas." He turned to look at me, eyes dark and serious. "There are things out there, things that we can't understand. They can look like us, sound like us, but they aren't us. You see a light out there, you hear a voice calling, you walk away, no hesitation." I wanted to ask what he knew, but something in his face stopped me. There was a weariness in his eyes, like he'd been carrying the weight of this truth for longer than I could imagine. "How long?" I began, my voice trailing off, not even sure how to form the question. He shook his head, as if to say it wasn't something he could explain. "It's just the way of things out here," he said finally, each word quiet, firm. On the drive home, the headlights cut through the darkness, casting shadows that felt too close, shapes that seemed to flit in and out of the beam. But I kept my eyes straight ahead. My mind raced. Flashes of that thing's hollow eyes and twisted smile burned into memory. I could still hear its voice, echoing my dad's words in that twisted, empty way. Whatever that presence was, it had known exactly what to say to draw me in, to mimic him. Back at home, I barely slept, images replaying in the dark, sounds from the forest filtering in. When dawn broke, I found my dad sitting at the kitchen table, the lines on his face deeper than I'd ever noticed. He handed me a cup of coffee and looked at me, his expression unreadable. "You understand now, don't you?" he asked, not unkindly. "Why I kept it all quiet, why I made the rules." I nodded, the weight of it all settling in a way I couldn't quite shake. That was the last night I joined him on his rounds. The forest had shifted in my mind, twisted into something different. The presence, whatever it was, didn't need to chase us, didn't need to harm us. It only had to watch, to wait for someone to slip up, to answer back. And I knew, with a cold certainty, that it would keep waiting. I'd been a ranger at Green Hollow long enough to know the sounds and moods of the place. Nights out there had a way of pressing in on you, and when you're alone in the woods, you learn to trust your gut. I was making my usual rounds, half listening to the crunch of gravel under my boots, when I noticed a set of footprints. They weren't the usual animal tracks or boot prints you'd expect. They were bare human feet. That caught my attention right away. Green Hollow's off the beaten path, and no one in their right mind would wander around barefoot at night, especially this time of year with the cold creeping in. The prints looked fresh too, pressed deep into the dirt like they'd just been made. My first thought was maybe a hiker got lost or some local wandered off drunk, but as I followed the tracks, something felt off. These prints led in a straight line through the brush, not like someone stumbling around. It was as if whoever made them knew exactly where they were going. I stayed quiet, listening for any sounds up ahead, but there was nothing, just those tracks guiding me toward a small clearing I hadn't paid much attention to before. As I reached the edge of the clearing, I spotted him. There, maybe 50 feet away, a figure stood, motionless, just watching. He was tall, lanky, almost too thin, with clothes that looked like they'd seen better days, dirty, frayed at the edges. His face was half in shadow, but from what I could see, he had sunken eyes and a hollow expression that made my skin crawl. I called out, keeping my voice steady, asking if he was okay or needed help. No response. He just kept looking at me, like he was trying to figure something out. I tried again, louder this time, but still, nothing. I could feel this odd tension between us, like I'd interrupted something I wasn't supposed to see. Part of me wanted to walk away, but curiosity has a funny way of keeping you in place when it shouldn't. Deciding enough was enough, I took a step toward him, and that's when I heard a faint crack. It wasn't coming from him, he hadn't moved an inch, but from somewhere off to my left, hidden in the trees. I glanced to the side, and in that split second, the figure bolted. He moved fast, faster than I expected, disappearing into the shadows before I could take another step. Just like that, he was gone, leaving me there, staring at an empty clearing and a scattering of footprints that led nowhere. I stood there, rooted to the spot, trying to process what had just happened. Whoever that man was, he'd vanished like a ghost. And the oddest thing was, the more I thought about it, the stranger it seemed. I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right, that there was more to this than just some lost hiker. When I got back to the station, I told a couple of the other rangers what I'd seen. Most of them laughed it off, saying it was probably some drifter or a local messing around. But then one of the older guys, Ray, gave me this look, like he knew something he wasn't saying. After a pause, he told me he'd seen someone similar a few months back, in nearly the same spot. Said the guy had looked out of place, like he didn't belong there. I couldn't get that image of the man's face out of my head, those empty eyes fixed on me, like he was trying to tell me something without saying a word. I knew I had to go back, had to see if there was any sign of him or what he'd been doing out there. The thought nagged at me the entire day until I finally decided I'd head back to that clearing after dark. The second night felt different, heavier somehow. As I made my way to the clearing, I kept replaying that moment in my mind, wondering what I'd missed, why he just stood there without a sound. When I reached the spot, I scanned the area, looking for anything out of place, anything that might explain the strange encounter. And then I saw it, just off to the side, nearly hidden by overgrown brush, a small, worn memorial stone, half buried in the ground. The engraving was hard to make out, but I managed to read a name and a date. 1960. It took me a moment to connect the dots. That name was familiar. Someone who'd gone missing out here decades ago, a story locals sometimes mentioned but never in detail. Seeing that name on the stone, Alan Creighton, it pulled at something buried deep in my memory. I'd heard it whispered around the local bars, mentioned in passing like a ghost story the town preferred to forget. Alan Creighton, the high school kid who'd vanished in 1960. They'd searched for him, of course, combing the woods for days, finding nothing but rumors. Some folks thought he'd just run off, others claimed he'd fallen into an old mine shaft. And yet, here I was, staring at a name carved into stone in a hidden corner of Green Hollow, the same place I'd seen that strange man. A cold feeling crept over me, something I hadn't felt in years as a ranger. I found myself talking out loud, half to keep my nerves steady, half hoping for a response. "Whoever you are, if you're lost, I can help you find a way out," I said, scanning the tree line for any sign of movement. The words echoed back, empty, like the forest itself was watching, waiting. I tried to push down the unease, telling myself it was just an odd coincidence, a forgotten memorial for a kid who disappeared years ago, but that didn't explain the man, his vacant stare, or the way he'd vanished. I walked a slow circle around the stone, looking for anything out of place, any sign that someone had been here recently. That's when I noticed a single weathered leather bracelet half buried in the dirt beside the stone. Picking it up, I could feel the rough texture worn down by time. I didn't need to see initials to know it belonged to someone who'd been through these woods a long time ago. As I headed back to the trail, I couldn't shake the feeling that the forest had grown, sharper. Every twig snap felt amplified, each gust of wind cutting through the trees. The path seemed to stretch longer, the shadows reaching out as if they wanted me to turn back. My grip tightened around the bracelet as if holding onto it might somehow bring clarity. The face of that man flickered in my mind, that hollow, intense stare, like he'd seen me, really seen me, and decided to stay silent. When I got back to the station, I stashed the bracelet in my drawer, hoping maybe Ray could shed some light on it. He'd been around long enough, seen strange things himself. But when I pulled it out the next morning, it was as if the bracelet had aged overnight. The leather was cracked, dry as if it had been left out in the sun for years. No one could explain it, and Ray just looked at me, saying, "Some things are better left in those woods." Over the next few nights, I tried to let it go, but curiosity got the best of me. I found myself drawn back to that clearing, searching for any sign of the figure or clues around that memorial. Each time, the forest seemed darker, more foreign. On my third visit, I heard footsteps following me, just far enough that I couldn't see who or what was making them. Pausing, I called out, half hoping for a response, half praying I wouldn't get one. But there was only silence, broken by the soft crunch of leaves moving closer. Then I spotted him again, off to the side, barely visible through the branches. His expression was the same, that hollow look, watching. This time he was closer. I could make out the faint outline of his mouth moving, though no words reached me. I took a step forward, the weight of the silence pressing in. "Are you Alan?" I asked, the name almost foreign on my tongue, after so many years of hearing it as nothing but a local legend. His eyes fixed on mine, and for a moment, I thought he might answer. But then, like a gust of wind had swept through, he faded back into the trees, leaving only the faintest imprint of footprints in the dirt. I couldn't tell if they were his or mine anymore. Back at the station, I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was a trick of the light, a product of too many long nights in the woods. But the bracelet was gone from my drawer, disappeared as mysteriously as the man had. The others laughed it off when I mentioned it, but Ray's face went pale. He pulled me aside, muttering about things best left unsaid, memories that tend to claw their way back when you start digging into the past. And then, one night, as I made my rounds, I found fresh footprints leading from the trail up toward the clearing. They were mine, but they were wrong, somehow, like I'd walked the path before and left something of myself behind. The sky was starting to lighten, just a hint, when I forced myself to get back in the truck and keep driving. I hadn't slept a second. How could I? Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that figure. Just standing, just staring, like he had every right to be out in the middle of nowhere at 3 a.m. I gripped the wheel tight and tried to shake it off, telling myself I was tired, stressed, seeing things. But no part of me believed it. Whatever was out there, it was real. As I drove, I kept glancing in my mirrors, like I half expected him to be following me. Ridiculous, I know. But paranoia has a way of creeping up on you when you've got miles of empty road behind and ahead. with no one around for miles. The gas gauge was falling faster than it should have, like something was sucking the life right out of my truck. I tapped it, hoping it was just faulty, but no such luck. I'd need a refill sooner than I thought. Somewhere near dawn, I spotted a gas station up ahead, one of those old-fashioned ones that somehow still operate out here. Relieved, I pulled up and parked, but as I got out, the place felt wrong. Deserted, dusty, not a soul in sight. The pumps looked like relics, scratched and faded, like they hadn't been used in years. But I was desperate, so I tried to make it work. As soon as I lifted the pump, though, the faint sound of a radio crackled from inside the station, cutting through the eerie quiet. My blood ran cold. Who else could possibly be out here? I stepped toward the door, listening to the static rise and fall, and caught snippets of a voice, disjointed, broken, like someone trying to get a message through. Help! Truck, stranded. The words felt like they were clawing at the back of my mind. It wasn't possible, but the voice was the same one I'd heard over my CB. It sounded like him, the man on the road. I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see him standing there again, but the road was empty. Inside, the station was dim, lit only by a dusty bulb hanging from the ceiling. It flickered weakly, like it might give out any second. Behind the counter, an old radio sat, crackling and stuttering with that same voice. I reached out, hesitating, then turned the volume up. Lost. Out here. It crackled, then cleared, and I could swear it said my name. My heart skipped. I hadn't told anyone I was coming through here. I was alone on this road, no other trucks in sight, and yet this stranger's voice had found me. I yanked my hand back, leaving the radio sputtering behind me. I stumbled out of the station, feeling a strange urge to look back over my shoulder. Nothing but empty road, stretching out endlessly, as if the station and I were the only things left in existence. I filled up the truck in a hurry, hands shaking, and got back on the road, wanting to leave that place as fast as possible. But the voice stayed with me, replaying in my mind like a song you can't shake. Who was that man, and how did he know my name? As I drove, something about the landscape seemed altered. The hills didn't look familiar. The trees looked like they were in the wrong places, twisted and bare. It was subtle at first, easy to dismiss, but soon I realized I was passing the same landmark over and over, a broken-down billboard that should have been miles back by now. Every instinct told me to turn around, but there was nowhere else to go. Hours passed, or maybe just minutes. It was impossible to tell. The sky stayed an ominous shade of gray, like the dawn had frozen. I checked the clock, but it was flickering, unreadable. Every time I looked, the numbers were different. 5 and 9:17, 2:43. Time was slipping, sliding around me, and all I could do was keep driving. Then, out of nowhere, the figure appeared again, right in my headlights. I slammed the brakes, skidding to a halt, but this time, I didn't get out. I just sat there, gripping the wheel, watching as he moved closer, step by agonizing step, until his face was almost pressed against the glass. Pale, drawn, eyes so empty they felt like holes punched in reality. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. I understood somehow that he was trapped out here, caught in this endless stretch of road, and now he'd marked me. I was part of this place too. He vanished after what felt like hours, leaving nothing but a faint handprint on the window, a stain that wouldn't wipe away no matter how hard I scrubbed. I tried the radio, but all I got was static, a low hum that seemed to whisper secrets just out of reach. The next day, I returned to the cabin, a strange mix of dread and determination pulling me along. I parked a little further down the road this time, wanting to take a cautious approach. As I stepped out of the truck, the chill in the air was sharper, more biting than before. I could hear my own heartbeat, each thump echoing the fear that swirled in my chest. I knew I had to confront whatever lingered in that abandoned place. The cabin stood there, still and solemn, as if waiting for me to make my move. My hands trembled slightly as I pushed the door open. It creaked, protesting my entry like an old man disturbed from his slumber. Inside, the remnants of a life lived long ago surrounded me. Dusty furniture, a forgotten photograph, and the faint smell of decayed wood. I felt a sense of being watched, as if the very walls were keeping secrets. I wandered deeper into the space, drawn by the curiosity that fought against my instincts. There was a small table in the corner, covered with odd trinkets and a single glass jar filled with something murky. I leaned closer, and as I did, a flash of movement caught my eye. It was quick, just a shadow darting past the window, but my heart raced. Was it just my imagination? I wondered, my voice barely a whisper in the stillness. Hello? Is anyone here? My voice felt hollow, swallowed by the emptiness. No response. Just the rustling of something outside, perhaps a branch or an animal. But deep down, I knew this wasn't just an ordinary place. I reached for my phone, hoping to capture something, anything. My fingers grazed the screen, but there was no signal. Just a chilling reminder of how isolated I truly was. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being lured here, as if the cabin itself had some dark purpose. I glanced at the walls adorned with peeling wallpaper, each flake a testament to years of neglect. Memories were buried here, joyful gatherings, sorrowful farewells. Yet there was an undercurrent of something sinister, a whisper of pain etched into the very wood. It felt like a warning, begging me to leave. As I turned to leave, I noticed a door I hadn't seen before, slightly ajar. I approached it, and a cold breeze seemed to push me back. My mind raced, recalling the tales of hauntings that had filled my childhood, stories of spirits unable to find peace. With a deep breath, I swung the door open and was greeted by a staircase leading down into darkness. The air was thick, heavy with inexplicable dread that coiled around my throat. Should I really do this? I questioned, hesitating at the threshold. It was a pull stronger than fear, a need to understand what this place was hiding. I descended slowly, the wooden steps creaking under my weight. With each step, my resolve wavered, the reality of my decision dawning on me. This wasn't a ghost story. This was my life. When I reached the bottom, the darkness engulfed me. The faint light from above barely illuminated a small room filled with old furniture draped in sheets. I could feel something shifting in the air, a charged energy that prickled at my skin. Then, I saw it, a faded photograph on a table. It was of a family, their faces smiling, yet their eyes seemed vacant, hollow. A chill crept down my spine as I recognized the old man in the photo. He looked just like me. Suddenly, a loud bang echoed from behind me, followed by a low, anguished groan. I spun around, my heart pounding. "Who's there?" I shouted, my voice trembling. Silence enveloped me, but in that quiet, I could hear my own breathing, quick and shallow. I took a step back, realizing I was not alone in this space, not by a long shot. Just then, I felt a rush of cold air and a whisper, barely audible but chilling. "Get out." The command reverberated in my mind, primal and urgent. I turned to flee, the weight of the room pressing down on me. As I scrambled up the stairs, the shadows seemed to chase me, claws of darkness grasping at my heels. I burst through the door, stumbling into the light, gasping for breath. Outside, the sun shone brightly, mocking the terror I had just faced. I could feel the cabin's pull lessening, yet something lingered, an unresolved connection. I drove away, vowing never to return, but as the trees blurred past, a thought gnawed at me. What if the shadows I encountered were not just remnants of the past, but a glimpse into my own future? As I glanced in the rearview mirror, the cabin loomed in the distance, a silent sentinel of secrets yet to be uncovered. And in that moment, I understood that some doors should remain closed, but the curiosity would always linger, whispering, waiting to be explored again. I'm Tom Bridges, the forest ranger here in Willow Creek, Idaho, where the air is crisp and the trees stand like sentinels over the land. Every morning, I drive past the serene waters of Blackwater Lake, a place that has seen its share of beauty and terror. People come here for fishing, hiking, and the occasional camping trip. But beneath that calm surface lies a history few know about. A history that's whispered in the wind and left to fester in the shadows. On that fateful morning, I just finished my shift, ready to head home, when the radio crackled to life. "Tom, we've got a report of strange lights coming from across the lake," came the voice of Sheriff Dawson, a familiar mix of authority and concern. I raised an eyebrow, curious. "What kind of lights?" I asked. He hesitated, then replied, "Don't know, but it's not normal. No boats should be out there at this hour." A chill crept in as I grabbed my gear. As I paddled out into the misty waters, I felt the familiar weight of solitude. The lake lay still, yet there was an unshakable tension in the air. With each stroke, the water lapped against my kayak, breaking the silence. I squinted into the distance, where I could see a flickering glow. My heart raced, an odd sensation, like being drawn into a trap. Something was out there, something that didn't belong. When I reached the spot, my eyes widened. A boat was adrift, empty and eerily quiet. The water swirled around it, as if disturbed by a hidden force. This doesn't feel right, I thought, glancing around for signs of life. I scanned the shore, searching for anything that might explain what I was witnessing. "Hello?" I called, my voice echoing back, swallowed by the darkness. No reply came, just the persistent sound of water against the hull. That's when I felt it, a soft thud against the side of my kayak. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. Was it a fish or something more sinister? I turned quickly, expecting to see the ripples dissipating, but instead, there was nothing. Only the gentle lapping of water, mocking me in the quiet night. I shook my head, convincing myself it was just my imagination playing tricks. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. As I paddled back, the flickering light continued to dance in the distance. It felt like a beacon, calling me back to the darkness I had just escaped. "Just ignore it," I muttered to myself. "You've got a job to do." But each stroke felt heavier, laden with the weight of unseen eyes watching from the shadows. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting just beneath the surface, ready to pull me under. Back at the ranger station, I recounted the night's events to Sheriff Dawson and the other deputies. "You didn't see anyone out there?" he asked, eyebrow raised. "No one," I replied, crossing my arms defensively. But the boat was there, and the water, it felt alive. They exchanged skeptical glances, dismissing my concerns. "Tom, it's probably just some kids messing around. Nothing to worry about," Dawson said. But I couldn't shake the nagging doubt that gnawed at me. Days turned into weeks, and the flickering lights became a regular sight on the lake. I found myself drawn back, each time hoping to find answers, but all I discovered were whispers of the past. Locals spoke in hushed tones about a family that had vanished 30 years ago. No bodies found, no clues left behind. "It's just a legend," I told myself. Yet the thought of their disappearance haunted me. Why did the lights return every year? One evening, as I sat in my cabin, I pulled out the old records of missing persons from the local library. The case files on the family were old and worn, but their story was vivid. The night they disappeared, a storm raged over the lake, yet no one had heard a single scream. "This is insane," I murmured, shaking my head. What could have happened? The more I read, the more questions I had. Each page turned, another layer of mystery unfolded, leaving me in a web of intrigue and dread. I was caught in something much larger than myself, and I could feel it pulling me closer to the edge. I spent the next few days obsessing over the case of the vanished family. Each night, I found myself poring over old newspapers and dusty records at the library. The more I dug, the more the pieces of their story began to fit together, like a puzzle that revealed a dark portrait. They'd been a typical family, 2 parents and their little girl. But that summer, everything changed. They went on a camping trip to the lake, and no one saw them again. The town had searched tirelessly, but only whispers remained. One afternoon, I decided to visit the last place they were seen, Camp Echo, just a short hike from the ranger station. I felt an odd mix of excitement and dread as I packed my bag. This wasn't just about a family lost to time. It was about uncovering what really happened. As I made my way along the trail, memories of campers and hikers filled my mind. I recalled the joy of people around fires, laughter echoing in the woods. But today, the forest felt different, almost like it was holding its breath. Reaching the campsite, I was struck by the eeriness of it all. The picnic tables stood abandoned, and the fire pit was overgrown. I set my bag down and took a deep breath, letting the chill of the air settle around me. This is where they were, I thought, scanning the area. I imagined the family setting up their tent, unaware of the dark fate that awaited them. As I walked closer to the water's edge, I felt a presence, an invisible weight that pressed against my chest. "Why did you come here?" I whispered to the empty trees, half expecting a reply. No answer, just the gentle rustle of leaves, as if the forest itself was shushing my questions. I pulled out my notepad, jotting down observations, hoping the act of writing would ground me in reality. But the deeper I delved into the family's story, the more unsettling details emerged. The mother had written letters to her sister, expressing fears about something lurking in the woods. What did she mean? I pondered, my mind racing. Suddenly, I noticed a faded, weathered sign at the edge of the camp. It read, "Danger, do not approach the water alone." My heart raced as I recalled the stories from locals about people disappearing near the lake, drawn in by strange lights. Could it be the same thing? I thought. I felt a shiver of anxiety as I glanced at the water, glimmering under the afternoon sun. The lake seemed inviting, yet ominous, a beauty hiding sinister secrets. As I gathered my things to leave, a low rustling caught my attention. I turned, expecting to see a deer or some other forest creature. Instead, I saw a figure standing just beyond the tree line, shrouded in shadow. "Hello?" I called out, but the figure didn't move. It was almost as if it was waiting for me to approach. My instincts screamed at me to run, but curiosity held me in place. Who was this person, and what did they know about the lake? The figure finally stepped forward, revealing an older woman with a weathered face and deep-set eyes. "You shouldn't be here," she said, her voice gravelly, laced with urgency. "This place holds memories best left forgotten." I took a step back, taken aback by her intensity. "I'm just trying to understand what happened to the family," I replied, my voice steadier than I felt. Her eyes narrowed as she scanned the area, almost as if she feared someone else might be listening. "There are things in these woods you don't understand," she warned, glancing toward the lake. "People don't just vanish without reason. It's the water. It calls to them." I felt a chill run down my spine. "What do you mean?" I asked, my heart pounding. She hesitated, then whispered, "They didn't just disappear, they were taken." My stomach twisted as her words sank in, each syllable weighing heavily on my mind. Before I could press her for more information, she turned and walked away, disappearing into the dense trees. "Wait!" I shouted, but she didn't look back. I stood there, heart racing, battling the urge to follow her into the unknown. But something held me back. It was as if the forest itself was warning me to stay put. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had stumbled upon something far more dangerous than I ever anticipated. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the campsite, I decided it was time to leave. The unsettling encounter played over and over in my mind. I hiked back to my truck, my pulse quickening with every step. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was on the brink of uncovering something monumental, but it came with a cost. What price would I have to pay to uncover the truth? I remember the moment I first stepped into that abandoned cabin. My flashlight flickered against the peeling walls, revealing remnants of a life once lived. The air inside was thick with dust, and every creak of the floorboards echoed like a whisper from the past. I thought about the stories I had heard over the years, the tales of hunters vanishing and the locals' uneasy glances whenever the cabin was mentioned. Just an old building, I told myself, but deep down I knew better. Something about that place stirred a primal fear in me, one I couldn't shake. I glanced around, hoping to convince myself I was just being paranoid. But the sight of my patrol notes lying on the table sent a chill racing down my spine. How could they be there? I'd left them years ago, in a cabin I thought had been demolished. "This can't be real," I muttered, trying to rationalize the impossible. Each question piled onto another, creating a knot of anxiety in my stomach. It was like staring into a mirror, reflecting my deepest fears. Then it hit me. The stories weren't just folklore, they held grains of truth. As I walked back to my truck, unease clawed at my mind. I had always dismissed tales of hauntings and mysteries, but this was different. I couldn't shake the feeling that the forest was watching, waiting for me to uncover something far darker than mere stories. I climbed into my vehicle, gripping the steering wheel as if it would anchor me to reality. "Get a grip," I said aloud, trying to drown out the growing panic. But no matter how I tried to focus on the road ahead, my thoughts circled back to the cabin. What if I wasn't alone? What if whatever had lingered there had taken an interest in me? The night pressed against the windows like a living thing, its breath chilling the air. I could almost hear the rustling of branches in the distance, like the forest was whispering secrets meant only for me. As I made my way down the winding road, the trees began to blur into shadows. I couldn't shake the feeling that something or someone was following. My heart raced with every twist and turn. I glanced into my rearview mirror, half expecting to see a figure standing in the back seat. Nothing there, I reassured myself, but the feeling of dread deepened. It was as if I was being pulled into a nightmare I couldn't escape. When I finally arrived at the station, I rushed inside, needing the safety of familiar faces. But the moment I shared my story, the room fell silent. My colleagues exchanged knowing glances, their expressions unreadable. "You saw it too?" one of them whispered, his voice barely above a murmur. The unease in the air was palpable. It turned out they had heard the same stories, about a figure in the woods, a shadow that appeared and disappeared at will. Days turned into weeks, but I couldn't forget that night. Each time I patrolled, I felt an invisible weight pressing down on me, a reminder of what I had encountered. I thought I had left the past behind, but it clung to me like the scent of pine. I kept hearing hushed voices among the trees, but I couldn't understand what they were saying. Each time I turned, I saw only branches swaying gently, teasing me with their secrets. And then, one fateful evening, I found myself drawn back to the clearing. I had no intention of going back, yet my feet moved as if guided by an unseen force. The shadows lengthened, and the air grew colder as I approached the cabin once more. "What are you doing, Ben?" I thought, feeling like I was crossing a line I couldn't uncross. As I stepped inside, the familiar dread washed over me, intensifying with every passing second. Suddenly, the atmosphere shifted. The walls seemed to breathe, and the cabin whispered secrets that clawed at my sanity. I found my old notes again, untouched since that night. But this time, they were different. The handwriting had changed, morphing into something unrecognizable. It was like the past was rewriting itself right before my eyes. My breath caught in my throat, and the realization hit me like a jolt. Whatever presence lingered here was not just a memory, it was alive, and it was waiting for me. As I stepped back, heart racing, I knew I was teetering on the edge of a reality that defied explanation. There were no ghosts here, only shadows of the past that held the power to shape the future. And in that moment, I understood. Some stories aren't just told, they're lived, woven into the fabric of time itself, waiting for someone foolish enough to unravel them. Returning to that cabin was a mistake, yet I felt an undeniable pull. Each time I ventured into the woods, it was as if the trees whispered secrets I had yet to uncover. I could still recall the way the air shifted when I first entered that place, the way it felt like stepping into another time. I told myself to stay away, but curiosity is a relentless beast. It gnaws at you until you give in, and the moment I set foot inside again, I felt the weight of history pressing down. The moment I crossed the threshold, the familiar dread returned. Dust motes danced in the beam of my flashlight, and shadows clung to the corners like uninvited guests. I shook my head, trying to dispel the fog of anxiety swirling in my mind. "You've faced worse, Ben," I whispered to myself. But the reassuring words felt hollow. Something about the cabin felt alive, as if it were aware of my presence, waiting for me to acknowledge it. As I stepped further inside, I noticed something strange, fresh footprints in the dust on the floor. Panic surged through me. Who had been here? The cabin had been deserted for years. My instincts screamed at me to leave, but a voice deep inside urged me to stay, to investigate. "What are you hoping to find?" I thought, wrestling with my own curiosity. Was I looking for answers, or was I simply inviting trouble into my life? I reached for the nearest wall, brushing my fingers against the rough wood. Memories flooded back, scenes from my patrols, the countless nights spent alone under the stars. It was hard to believe that this cabin, once a simple shelter, had transformed into a focal point of my fears. What if I'm not alone here? I pondered, my heart racing with each creak of the floor. I turned to leave, but my foot caught on something. Looking down, I saw a rusted key, half buried in the dust. Where does it lead? The question lingered in the air as I picked up the key, its weight heavy in my palm. I felt a strange connection to it, as if it held the answers to questions I hadn't even asked. But what could possibly lie behind a locked door in a forgotten cabin? The possibilities both intrigued and terrified me. With every heartbeat, the cabin seemed to come alive, its walls pulsing with a rhythm that mirrored my own rising anxiety. Then I heard it, a soft thud followed by a low sound that felt like a heartbeat echoing in the silence. My breath hitched and I froze. Was that my imagination? I wondered, trying to rationalize the noise. I slowly turned my head, scanning the room for the source. Nothing moved, yet the tension in the air thickened. The feeling of being watched crept back in, a reminder of my earlier fears. I glanced at the door, wondering if I should make a run for it. Instead, I took a deep breath and moved toward a closet in the corner. My hands trembled as I reached for the door handle, every instinct screaming for me to turn back. This is insane, I thought. You're a park ranger, not some ghost hunter. But the urge to know what lay beyond the threshold overwhelmed me. I gripped the handle, my heart pounding like a drum as I swung the door open. Inside, I found old camping gear, sleeping bags, rusted tools, and a faded map of the area. I picked up the map, its edges crumbling in my hands, and saw markings I didn't recognize. Some of them were dated, pointing to places I had never heard of. A chill ran down my spine. What happened here? I asked aloud, but the only answer was the rustling of the wind outside. I felt the hairs on my arms stand on end as if the very air around me was charged with energy, thick with unspoken stories. Just as I was about to close the closet door, I noticed something glinting at the back, a small wooden box. My pulse quickened as I reached for it, but a voice in my head urged caution. What if it's just junk? I tried to convince myself, but curiosity was a relentless beast, and I couldn't help but lift the lid. Inside, I found trinkets, old photographs, a locket, and a collection of letters. Each item told a story, but one photograph caught my eye. It was a group of men standing outside the very cabin I was in, their faces obscured but familiar. I felt a jolt of recognition. One of them looked like a younger version of myself, and a wave of nausea washed over me. What is going on here? I gasped, the truth dawning on me like a slow sunrise. I was connected to this place in ways I couldn't begin to understand. It was more than a cabin. It was a vessel for memories, for past lives intertwining with my own. The threads of fate were woven tightly around me, and I realized that uncovering the truth might come at a cost. As I carefully placed the photograph back in the box, the cabin creaked around me, as if acknowledging the revelation. I took a step back, my mind racing with possibilities. Every decision, every moment of hesitation could change everything. I stood there, heart racing, fully aware that I had crossed a threshold into a world where the past and present collided. What awaited me next was unknown, but I was determined to uncover the truth, no matter where it led. I took a deep breath as I glanced at the darkened road ahead. The headlights of my truck sliced through the thick blackness, revealing nothing but the endless asphalt stretching before me. I had thought I was alone on this desolate stretch of highway, yet the feeling of being watched gnawed at my insides, an itch I couldn't scratch. Memories of the strange events from earlier swirled in my mind. Images of the bizarre man in the woods, the eerie silence that followed him, and the overwhelming sense of dread that engulfed me. Suddenly, the radio sputtered back to life, interrupting my thoughts. A familiar voice crackled through, echoing the pleas I had heard earlier. "Help me, please! I'm trapped!" My heart raced. This was the same voice I had heard in the woods. I gripped the wheel tighter, muscles tense. Was this some sort of sick joke, or was I really being pulled into something I couldn't comprehend? It felt like one of those classic horror movies where the unsuspecting protagonist walks into a trap. "Where are you?" I shouted, half expecting a response. Instead, the line fell silent, leaving only the dull thrum of my engine and the rustle of leaves outside. I glanced at my surroundings, the trees casting twisted shadows in the moonlight, creating ghostly figures that danced just beyond my vision. I shook my head again, trying to clear the unsettling imagery. "Focus, Carl," I told myself, "just get home." I pushed the accelerator down, determined to put as much distance between myself and this unsettling night as possible. Yet, the farther I drove, the more the landscape began to change. The familiar turns of the highway morphed into strange, unrecognizable paths. It felt like I was moving through a dream, an unsettling dream that refused to let me wake up. I glanced at the GPS, and to my horror, it flashed no signal. My pulse quickened. I was lost. The realization hit me like a cold wave. I wasn't just lost, I was trapped in a nightmare. I tried to convince myself that it was just the fatigue playing tricks on me. After all, I was a seasoned trucker. I'd driven countless miles, faced dangerous roads, and braved the wild at all hours. Yet nothing had prepared me for this. I felt an overwhelming urge to turn around, to retrace my steps, but the fear of what lurked behind me kept me moving forward. Then I saw it, a figure standing in the road ahead, illuminated by my headlights. A shiver crawled down my spine. Was it real, or was my mind finally giving in to the exhaustion? I slammed on the brakes, skidding to a stop inches away from the figure. It stood still, its features obscured by darkness, but I could feel its eyes piercing through the gloom, locking onto me. "Help," it whispered, voice trembling, an echo of the earlier plea. My instincts screamed at me to run, yet a part of me felt compelled to get out and confront whatever was before me. "Who are you?" I shouted, my voice cracking. The figure didn't respond, it only pointed toward the trees behind it. "There's something out there," it said softly, its words chilling me to the bone. "You have to see." In that moment, I was torn between fleeing and understanding, the relentless pull of curiosity outweighing the instinct to escape. I finally decided to step out of the truck, heart pounding. The night air was thick, almost suffocating. As I approached, the figure dissolved into the shadows, and I stumbled back, realizing I had been led into something I couldn't comprehend. I turned to run back to my truck when the sound of rustling leaves filled the air. Then, from the darkness emerged shadows, figures, countless figures, all staring at me with hollow eyes. My mind raced as I scrambled back into the safety of my cab, slamming the door shut. Panic surged through me as the reality of the situation hit me hard. I wasn't alone. I had walked into a world of nightmares, far beyond my understanding. The shadows pressed closer, their whispers filling my ears. "You can't escape." With that, I understood I was caught in a web of fear, one I might never escape, a living horror that stretched beyond this night. As I sat trembling, I realized that sometimes the darkest roads lead not just to unknown destinations, but to the deepest fears within ourselves. And those fears, they never really leave. I'm Henry Lawson, a forest ranger in the heart of Mount Echo, Colorado. My life revolves around the changing seasons, the thrill of tourists seeking adventure, and the occasional lost hiker needing a guiding hand. After years spent navigating these rugged trails, I'd seen it all. People searching for solace in nature, the thrill seekers pushing limits, and families creating memories under the vast sky. But one chilly night, everything changed when I received a call that would haunt me. The radio crackled with static, then a panicked voice broke through. "Help! I'm trapped. I'm on the trail, and something's got me." The urgency in the caller's tone sent a chill down my spine. It was late, and the mountain was unforgiving after dark, yet something compelled me to act. I quickly gathered my gear, reminding myself of the countless times I had rescued stranded hikers. "This is just another night," I told myself, though I felt the weight of dread creep in. As I drove deeper into the forest, the towering pines loomed like silent sentinels, shadows stretching across the road. I followed the signal on my GPS, leading me to a remote trailhead barely marked on the map. The moon cast an eerie glow, illuminating the rough path ahead. What kind of trouble could someone find themselves in at this hour? I wondered aloud, gripping the steering wheel tighter. The cold air seeped in, but I pressed on, fueled by a mixture of curiosity and concern. Upon arrival, I felt the unsettling quiet settle around me. No rustle of leaves, no distant voices, just an oppressive stillness. I grabbed my flashlight, its beam slicing through the darkness as I stepped onto the trail. Each crunch of gravel beneath my boots echoed in the night, amplifying my sense of isolation. "Where are you?" I called out, hoping for a response. The only answer was the wind, carrying a hint of something unsettling. Then I saw it, a weathered backpack abandoned on the ground. It looked as if it had been there for ages, the fabric faded and torn. I approached cautiously, my heart racing as I noticed an old radio, still sputtering out the same desperate plea for help. "Who were you?" I murmured, running my fingers over the worn leather straps. It felt like a connection to something lost, a story waiting to be uncovered. As I sifted through the backpack, I discovered a few personal items: a half-empty water bottle, a tattered map, and a small photograph of a smiling couple. They seemed happy, carefree, enjoying the mountains like so many others before them. I recognized their faces, They had vanished from this very trail years ago. The last message recorded by another ranger echoed in my mind, a cry for help that had gone unanswered. The couple had simply disappeared without a trace. "Why did you come here?" I whispered to the empty woods, the weight of their fate pressing down on me. I suddenly felt as though I was intruding on something sacred. I could almost hear their laughter, feel the warmth of their lives that had been extinguished so abruptly. I was standing in a place steeped in mystery, a chapter in a forgotten book of horrors. Just as I turned to leave, I heard it, clear as day, their voice, the same one from the radio, calling out again. "Help me, I'm still here." But the radio lay silent in my hands. Confusion swirled in my mind. Had I really heard it? Or was my imagination playing tricks on me? I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see shadows moving among the trees, but there was nothing. My heart raced as I hurried back to my truck, the weight of the night pressing against me like a heavy fog. "This can't be happening," I muttered. I tried to rationalize, to dismiss the voice as a figment of my imagination. Yet, the chill of reality clung to me, leaving a trail of unease. Who or what was still calling for help? As I drove away from that haunted spot, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was leaving more than just a backpack behind. The whispers of the past tugged at me, blending with the hum of the engine. The mountain held its secrets tight, and I was merely a visitor in its vast, wild embrace. Little did I know, the echoes of that night would linger long after I left the trail, weaving a thread between the living and the lost that I could never sever. After that unsettling night, I couldn't shake off the feeling of being watched. Every rustle in the underbrush felt like a reminder of the backpack left behind, a tether to the couple who vanished without explanation. Days turned into weeks, yet the echo of their desperate cries lingered in my mind, almost like a ghost haunting the edges of my thoughts. Each time I set foot on a trail, I found myself scanning the shadows, half expecting to see them standing there, pleading for help. My colleagues noticed my change in demeanor. "You all right, Henry?" one of them asked while we were gathering for our morning briefing. I shrugged, dismissing it as just another day. "Just a rough night on patrol," I replied. I didn't want to burden anyone with my concerns, especially when they seemed so irrational. But the unease was becoming hard to ignore. I began to research unsolved disappearances in the area, hoping to find some semblance of understanding. The deeper I dug, the more chilling the stories became. One evening, I sat at my kitchen table, poring over old articles. There were countless accounts of people who had gone missing over the years, each tale more unsettling than the last. A hiker here, a family camping there, none found. It was as if the forest itself swallowed them whole. I couldn't help but think about the couple from the photo I had seen. They had looked so alive, so full of dreams. What had happened to them? What had drawn them into those woods? A few days later, I decided to revisit the trail where I found the backpack. Maybe it was foolish, but something compelled me to return, as if I were chasing the ghosts of their story. As I walked, the path felt different, like it had morphed since my last visit. The trees seemed taller, the underbrush denser. I couldn't shake the feeling that the forest was shifting, closing in around me. It was as if I was intruding on a secret world, one that didn't take kindly to outsiders. I reached the spot where I found the backpack and knelt down, scanning the ground for any clues. Suddenly, a noise broke the stillness, a snap of a twig, sharp and jarring. I shot up, heart racing, and called out, "Hello? Is anyone there?" Silence answered me, thick and unsettling. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my nerves. "It's just the wind," I whispered to myself, but doubt gnawed at my insides. Just as I was about to turn back, a chill brushed against my neck, and instinctively, I spun around. Standing at the edge of the trees was a figure, obscured by shadows. My breath caught. "Who's there?" I demanded, my voice shaking slightly. The figure didn't move, just stood there, watching. My instincts screamed to run, but something held me in place, a morbid curiosity, perhaps, or an unshakable need for answers. The figure stepped closer, and my heart pounded in my chest. "Help me," it whispered, the voice hauntingly familiar. It was the same voice I had heard on the radio, but it echoed with a chilling emptiness. I took a step back, the realization hitting me like a cold wave. Was this the spirit of the lost couple? Were they trapped in some eternal loop, forever seeking aid? "Please," the figure urged, its voice laced with desperation. I was frozen, torn between the instinct to flee and the overwhelming need to understand. "What happened to you?" I managed to ask, my voice barely above a whisper. The figure simply pointed deeper into the forest. It felt like an invitation, a beckoning toward the unknown. Despite every fiber of my being telling me to run, I took a hesitant step forward. As I crossed the threshold into the thicket, an eerie sense of calm enveloped me, contrasting sharply with the chaos swirling inside my mind. "What am I doing?" I thought, but it felt too late to turn back now. The deeper I ventured, the thicker the air felt, charged with an energy I couldn't explain. I could feel the weight of countless eyes on me, as if the forest itself was alive, aware of my presence. Each step took me further into their story, one I hadn't anticipated becoming a part of. "I need to know," I told myself, fueled by a mix of fear and determination. Whatever awaited me in those woods, I was ready to face it, driven by a longing for resolution, or perhaps by the insatiable need to uncover the truth hidden within the shadows. I pushed deeper into the woods, driven by an inexplicable pull. The trees loomed overhead, their branches twisting like skeletal fingers. Every step felt weighted, as if the ground itself was holding its breath. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was crossing a line, stepping into a realm where nature and something else intertwined. "What are you trying to show me?" I whispered, half expecting an answer, half terrified by the idea that I might get one. The figure lingered just out of sight, its presence a constant reminder of my pursuit. "You need to find the truth," it seemed to say without words. I shook my head, trying to clear my thoughts. "Truth about what? What do you want me to understand?" My voice echoed in the stillness, but there was no response. The forest remained quiet, as if it was part of a pact to keep the secrets buried. As I walked, memories of past patrols flooded my mind, searching for lost hikers, rescuing those who strayed too far. Each incident had a story, each person a life intertwined with this land. I had always believed that nature was a haven, a refuge from the chaos of life. But here, it felt more like a labyrinth, one that could just as easily consume me. My heart raced as I recalled the articles I had read about those who vanished. Were they also chasing shadows, desperate to solve a mystery that wasn't theirs to solve? Suddenly, I stumbled upon a clearing, a patch of ground that felt strangely familiar. In the center lay a circle of stones, weathered and worn, as if they had been placed there by hands long gone. I approached cautiously, feeling a chill radiate from the stones. "What is this place?" I murmured, crouching down to inspect them. They looked ancient, like a forgotten altar. A part of me felt drawn to it, while another part screamed for me to turn back. As I reached out to touch the stones, a vision flashed through my mind, a couple laughing, dancing around a fire. They were so alive, so full of joy. My breath caught as the scene morphed. The laughter faded into screams, their faces twisted in terror as shadows closed in around them. I jerked my hand back, heart racing. "This is where it happened," I thought, the realization crashing over me like a wave. "Why didn't I see it before?" I whispered, the words barely escaping my lips. It all made sense now. The couple hadn't just vanished. Something had taken them. The figure I'd seen earlier was a manifestation of their plea for help, trapped in a cycle, a reminder of the danger lurking just beyond the trees. I could feel their anguish, the weight of their despair wrapping around me, pulling me down into darkness. Panic surged within me. I can't stay here, I thought, but my legs wouldn't move. It felt as if the ground was rooting me in place, keeping me from escaping. The forest was alive with a rhythm, an unspoken language that resonated in my bones. I had ventured too far into its embrace. This isn't just a missing persons case, I realized. It was something far more sinister, something that fed on fear and drew people in. "Help us," a voice called out, echoing through the trees. I looked around, searching for the source, but only shadows met my gaze. I knew then that I had to uncover the truth, not just for myself, but for them. I needed to understand what happened in this place, to break the cycle that bound them here. "I will find a way," I promised, my voice trembling but resolute. Just as I turned to leave the clearing, a hand gripped my shoulder. I whipped around, breathless, ready to confront whatever awaited me. Instead, I found nothing, only the darkness that stretched endlessly before me. The figure was gone, but I could still feel its presence, urging me to continue, to delve deeper into the heart of this mystery. And as I stepped back onto the path, I knew there was no turning back. I pressed forward, heart pounding in my chest. With every step, the air thickened around me. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching. The sun had set, leaving only shadows in its wake. As I walked, a voice echoed in my mind, "You must seek the truth." It was the same voice that had guided me before, but now it felt more urgent, as if time was running out. I reached the edge of a small stream. The water flowed with a steady rhythm, but something about it felt off. It wasn't just the darkness, it was the way the surface shimmered as if it held secrets beneath. Could there be something in the water? I wondered aloud, kneeling to take a closer look. The reflection danced in the dim light, showing me not just my face, but a series of images, a couple by the stream, laughing, then a sudden plunge into darkness. A chill raced through me. "What happened to you?" I whispered to the water, as if it might answer. My thoughts spiraled back to the couple's last moments. Did they sense the danger before it swallowed them whole? I felt a connection, a thread binding me to their fate. They were the missing, forever entwined with this place. "I won't let your story end like this," I promised, standing back up with renewed determination. Suddenly, I heard a rustling nearby. I turned quickly, squinting into the underbrush. "Is anyone there?" I called out, my voice firm but betraying a hint of anxiety. Silence stretched, thick and unyielding, and just as I was about to convince myself it was nothing, a figure darted past me, barely visible in the gloom. "Hey!" I shouted, chasing after it, adrenaline surging. I stumbled through the trees, branches snagging at my clothes, but I couldn't slow down. The figure was fast, weaving between the trunks. "Stop!" I yelled, but it vanished as quickly as it had appeared. I halted, breathing heavily, trying to orient myself. What just happened? I thought, glancing around, searching for any sign of movement. In the stillness that followed, I realized I was completely alone. "You're losing it, Ben," I muttered to myself, running a hand through my hair. But the dread in my gut suggested otherwise. Something was out here. The way the figure moved, so effortlessly, felt wrong. It didn't belong to this world, or maybe it was just too intertwined with it. I need to find out what it wants, I decided, taking a deep breath to steady my resolve. I retraced my steps back to the clearing, the stones still standing sentinel in the dark. As I approached, the stones seemed to pulse with a life of their own, almost as if they were alive, watching me. "What did you witness?" I asked them, a hint of desperation creeping into my voice. "Help me understand." I placed my hand against the nearest stone, the cool surface grounding me. At that moment, I felt a surge of energy pass through me, a connection to something ancient and powerful. Images flashed before my eyes again. The couple, their laughter, the joy of a shared moment, then terror as something emerged from the shadows, pulling them into the void. They didn't deserve this, I realized, anger bubbling within me. I have to do something. Determination filled my veins as I took a step back from the stones. "You won't be forgotten," I vowed. I could feel the weight of their story pressing on my shoulders. "I'll uncover the truth of what happened here." As I turned to leave, a flicker of movement caught my eye. There, at the edge of the clearing, stood the figure again, watching, waiting. This time, instead of fear, I felt resolve. "I'm not afraid anymore," I called out, my voice steady. "If you want me to find you, then lead the way." The figure tilted its head slightly, a silent acknowledgement. With every heartbeat, the forest seemed to breathe around me, welcoming me into its depths. The journey was far from over, and the truth was still waiting to be uncovered. As I stood there, the figure began to move, gliding through the trees with a grace that felt unnatural. My heart raced, not from fear but from an overwhelming curiosity. "Where are you leading me?" I called out, my voice steady despite the uncertainty swirling inside me. The shadow paused, and I caught a glimpse of something, a flash of familiarity, like an echo from my own past. "Wait," I urged, pushing through the underbrush, determined to keep pace. With every step, I felt the weight of those lost souls pressing down. It reminded me of the old tales my grandmother used to tell, stories of people who had wandered too far into the woods, never to return. I'd always dismissed them as mere folklore. But now, standing in this very place, I began to question everything I thought I knew. This isn't just a story, I realized, a shiver creeping up my spine. This is real. The figure led me to a clearing bathed in moonlight, revealing stones arranged in a peculiar pattern. "What is this place?" I murmured, stepping closer. Each stone seemed to vibrate with energy, resonating with the past. The air around me shifted, and I could hear whispers, faint yet distinct. "Help us," they pleaded, a haunting chorus that sent chills through my core. I felt their desperation, their longing for recognition. "You're not forgotten," I promised aloud, my voice carrying into the night. Suddenly, the figure stopped and turned to face me. Its features were still indistinct, shrouded in shadow, but I sensed a connection. "Are you the one who brings the truth?" it seemed to ask without words. I hesitated, my mind racing. "I'm just a man searching for answers," I replied, my throat dry. "But I will do everything I can to uncover what happened to you." In that moment, I knew this was no mere ghost. It was a guide, a bridge between the living and the lost. I took a deep breath, steeling myself for what was to come. "What do you need from me?" I inquired, my voice steadying. As if answering, the stones began to shimmer, revealing a pattern etched into their surfaces. Images flashed before my eyes, a couple, laughing under the stars, then a sudden darkness swallowing their joy. "This is your story," I whispered, realization dawning. They had been a part of this land, bound to it by fate, and now they were trapped in a cycle of despair. In that moment, the energy shifted again. The air grew heavy with an unspeakable sorrow, and I felt the burden of their grief pressing upon me. "You were taken from this world," I understood, a wave of emotion crashing over me. "I can't bring you back, but I can tell your story." The figure nodded, its form flickering like a candle in the wind. "You must make others see," it urged, a deep urgency in its silent plea. Suddenly, a chilling realization washed over me. What if this has happened before? What if others came here, only to vanish? The thought echoed in my mind, igniting a new fear. How many souls are trapped in this cycle? I gasped, the enormity of their plight sinking in. The couple wasn't just a tragic tale. They were a warning, a call to action for anyone willing to listen. Then the figure stepped closer, its outline sharpening, revealing a face that mirrored my own. My breath caught in my throat. "No, this can't be," I stammered, backing away. "What does this mean?" It was then I realized I was connected to this place, not just as a witness, but as part of its dark history. Every story, every disappearance led back to me. "I'm not just here to tell your story. I'm part of it," I whispered in horror. In that instant, the clearing faded away, and I stood alone in the darkness, the weight of their suffering heavy on my shoulders. What have I done? I thought, my heart pounding. The truth surged through me, a chilling realization that the past wasn't just a collection of memories, it was alive, intertwining with my fate. I glanced back toward the forest, the whispering shadows growing ever more insistent. "I won't let your stories fade," I vowed, but deep down, I knew the true challenge lay ahead. "Remember," the wind seemed to carry their words, lingering in my mind as I stepped back into the night. "You are the keeper of our tale, but be careful, for the truth may be more than you bargained for." And with that, I vanished into the darkness, burdened yet resolute, knowing that the true horror had only just begun.